Well, welcome back. We're into the post lunch hour time, which means we've had to invite some very exciting folks here to keep us going in this time. We want to continue in this afternoon this theme of telling stories and of sharing stories of the life of the church, both past, present, and what it might look like in the future. But this afternoon, we wanted to spend a particular time of focus on the Quebec context, which we share. And we want to hear about what this is looking like in the Quebec context. And so we've invited three folks who are in ministry in this province. I'll introduce them all in just a moment. I'm going to invite each of them forward to tell us, and my urge to them and my invitation to them was to tell us a story. They may have to give us a little bit of context, but to really focus on one aspect of ministry, and sometimes that'll involve slides and sometimes not. So we'll hear those stories, and then I'll have some questions, and then and some further promptings, and then we'll turn it over to you as we move towards the end of our time together. So that's what we're here for right now. I think given that this is the order you're lined up in, this is the order I'm going to invite you to go in. So I'll introduce all three of them first and then invite them forward. Elizabeth Jones is the minister at Cedar Park United Church in Pointe-Claire. Elizabeth has been there for more than a decade, and prior to that worked down the street from me at the United Theological College. Elizabeth has done a lot of very interesting academic work in preaching and other subjects, and she's done a lot of teaching as well. But as I say, for more than the last decade, she's been at Cedar Park United, which is just a really a wonderful church. We actually had a college meeting there last fall, right around this same weekend, as a matter of fact. And so many of us were just struck by what the church was like physically as a kind of welcoming place. Jeffrey Metcalf is the canon theologian in the Diocese of Quebec, so that's the Anglican diocese based in Quebec City, and he lives in Quebec City, and he's also responsible for, in effect, regional ministry in the city of Quebec. Jeff is also a doctoral student at another place, the University of Toronto, where he's interested in race, identity, and ethics. And so he also combines his scholarship with on a daily basis, the lived life of the church in Quebec City. And then on the far end is Jim Pratt. Jim is the incumbent director at St. Philip's in Montreal West, where he's also been for more than a decade, 12 years, 13 almost. Prior to that was in Newfoundland. And prior to that was a lawyer, which nobody holds against him. And so Jim has been in ministry in Montreal West for quite some time as well. So as I say, we're going to hear from all three of them, and then we'll move into a discussion. So Elizabeth, over to you.
That way. Okay, now I'll turn this on. Okay, hi there, everybody. Good afternoon. I feel like I'm swimming in fairly Anglican water this afternoon, and that's always a whole lot of fun. It was good to catch up with West Islanders, so hello neighbors. So yeah, I'm at Cedar Park. This is Cedar Park, and you said a story. Well, I don't know about you, but I watch a lot of British crime drama, and they never just have one plot, right? There's a subplot weaving through it. So that's my excuse and why I'm actually getting two stories in on one. And so this is our church. As you can see, we are an affirming ministry of the United Church, and this is where we are. So we're right towards the western tip of the island, and as I point out, if that is my parish, I have lots of fish now that the river is cleaner. So that's our context. So we are definitely suburban. Those of you who know the history of that area. Pointe-Claire was a stop on the train station. It was a summer place for rich people who lived in the Golden Mile once upon a time, and it is home to a lot of people who work in various professions. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of who we are. So I'm going to begin with the prologue. And it begins in about 2017 when I went to an event put on by secular not-for-profit organizations talking about femme cachée, hidden hunger, which when you get further out into the burbs, hunger gets hidden in quite insidious ways, but if you're hungry, you're hungry. It doesn't matter whether it's insidious or not. So we came back from that, and basically in 2018, we decided to go big or go home. And taking Mark chapter 6, verse 37, you feed them. That's what we were trying to do. So food ministry had been sort of bubbling along for quite a while. But what we did, we found grants, we fundraised, we ripped out a tired kitchen, replacing it to code with a commercial kitchen. Oh, I'm going there. Yeah, there we go. So we put that in there. And so that was finished in early 2019. And we partnered with Meals on Wheels program twice a week with Colbe de Pain, which hosts life skills lunches. We were doing that twice per month. We were on the roster to cook hot meals for Calling All Angels, which was an outfit feeding downtown homeless folk. And we were on the baking roster for Chez Doris, which a lot of you know is an Indigenous support organization downtown. We were special event cooking for West Island Women's Shelter, and doing monthly cook-ins for Comfort Food Freezer. That's what you wanted me to talk about, isn't it, right? So the Comfort Food Freezer. And we were hosting a community meal. A lot of us have done that, right? Ours was called F4. It had started as an inward-looking fellowship event, and it was dwindling. So we turned it inside out. We made sure that we were on the radar of organizations serving the needs of food-insecure folk on the West Island, and by October 2019, we were feeding over 100 at each of those monthly events, sending folk home with leftovers. And fully 80% of the people who were there in October were not Cedar Park worshippers. That was the first of our experiences of changing places, if you will. Now the story begins proper, and in all good stories, on a dark and stormy night. And it was October the 31st, 2019. Out on the West Island, just after all the kids had finished their trick-or-treating, the heavens opened, the rains came down long and hard. The power went out, the sump pump at the church overflowed, it knocked out the secondary battery, and by 5 a.m. the next morning, we were knee-deep in water throughout the entire lower floor of our building. 57 centimeters. It's a lot of water. So our basement was home to our Healing Pathway ministry and a CPE daycare for 50 children. Speeding the story just a bit, by Sunday afternoon, we'd moved everything salvageable from the basement up to the main floor, basically rehoming the daycare into every usable nook and cranny that we had, including that beautiful new kitchen. We managed to keep Meals on Wheels going by a little bit of jiggling and what have you, but we were suddenly left with no gathering spaces except the sanctuary, which was full of pews, which meant that the drop-in day play group, the line dancing classes, the community choir, the Healing Pathway, they had nowhere to meet. So that Sunday, so the flood happened the Friday into Saturday, Sunday we called the board to an emergency meeting and approved, get this, the removal of 6 rows of pews from the front of the sanctuary temporarily to make usable space, medium-sized gathering at least. And just in case we thought better of that later in the week, we actually did it then and there, took them out. It's like, we got a yes, let's go. So it was removed and tidied up in time for us to host a refugee support brainstorming meeting. So this is my sidebar. What better theological conversation space can we have dreamt up for an otherwise pretty well-heeled congregation than to be in a place of displacement while we are talking about a much greater displacement that's going on globally. Thank you, God. You have a strange way of working. So back to the main plot. This damage was extensive. Let me just show you what so yeah. Am I supposed to be doing this? I can't remember. Yeah, I can do that. Sorry, there's my dark and stormy night. So there you can see. Somebody used the phrase that the pandemic has exposed an awful lot of how Christendom is dying. You can see that exposed an awful lot of a terrible floor with tiles of questionable content. So, the damage was extensive downstairs. It was going to take 4.5 months to complete. You can do the math, right? The daycare was able to return to its renovated basement space on March the 8th, 2020. Yeah, exactly. On March the 11th, the day the pandemic was declared, we held an emergency staff meeting using the conference call feature on the office phone, because that's all we had or knew about. On Friday the 13th, we were shut down tighter than a drum, and on March the 15th, I led worship by holding my iPhone at arm's length in an empty sanctuary, hoping to goodness that this thing called Facebook Live actually worked, because I didn't know it until then. So on screen, you could see a sanctuary with its broken tiles, half its pews missing, and all of its people. To say it was sad and scary is an understatement. Now, the CPE was not shut down because, get this, it was designated as an essential daycare for healthcare workers because we had a sanitary dedicated space that was up to code, which if we hadn't had a flood, we wouldn't have had. So thank you, God, for stable rental income through the pandemic. That was a gift, and I don't know whether you all had that or not, but it was a gift. But the best thing about all of that was our building was able to serve the neighborhood even while an awful lot of what churches do got shut down. So because we just spent 4.5 months learning how to make, do, and mend, we decided to go bold and shift as much of our ministry online as we could, even putting that outside the doors. So worship was live streamed from my home, which I dubbed Baylor Twine Studios because the camera was literally held up with duct tape, and there was Baylor twine in there, so somewhere. Congregational care, that is a whole other story, and I decided not to tell it, but it is a crucial undercurrent. We quickly got everybody into geographic clusters, told them to look out for each other, and just kept yammering on about that for the whole 2 months. Check on people in your clusters. So that's another story for another time. Food ministry, you can imagine, initially took the hit because Meals on Wheels was shut down by the government, and feeding folk downtown, thank God, underwent a significant overhaul on how that was being done. So we kind of got made redundant with that. Likewise with our F4s, but we snuck into the kitchen and we called it a stealth meals to seniors. We weren't supposed to be doing that, but nobody told us, so we just did it anyway. And we moved this comfort food freezer, that's what we called it. It's a small upright freezer, and we put it right by the entryway, and we would open the doors during the day, and food appeared and disappeared like clockwork right throughout the pandemic. We initially had started that as food to take to seniors or people coming out of hospital, and it just became, if you are at the end of your rope and you don't know what to feed your kids tonight, there's muffins in there, go get some. So the lockdown, and I'm really telling a pandemic story here, I guess, it gave us time to stop and consider and dream and imagine just what it was that we and God wanted from a sanctuary space. And it gave us, I think, enough time to shift from mending to making. So we began to dream of a space that was permanently flexible, where we could feed people, because we'd done that for 2 months. Once the community hall was being used by the daycare, we could feed 100 people in there easy. Could we host community events like concerts, public meetings, labyrinth meditations, youth meetings, gatherings, and things like that? I was known before this as the person who would make labyrinths out of bits of tree or shells or whatever, temporary, ephemeral labyrinths. So this comes into the story. So that's what we've done. There's Bela Twine. There's the comfort food freezer, just getting caught up. And that was dealing with the mess in the floor in the sanctuary. And that's what we did. So the labyrinth was throw it out there, not expecting it to land, but you throw it out there anyway. We decided we were not going to put tiles down, but a poured floor. And I looked at it and said, it's nice and big and gray. What would it look like if we put a labyrinth on there? We have aerospace engineers in our congregation. Surely if they can put something up into space, they can help us get this labyrinth on the floor. So we bought a template and we literally painted that thing onto the floor. And then peeled off a stencil and what have you. It was quite something, but it's there. And obviously we did not put pews back on top of it, but we have got chairs in there instead, just like these. They look like they came from the same place. We completed also, let me show you this. So the view that you're getting, the church was built in 55. They put a balcony in it and ran out of money. So it had no flooring and no access. So literally, we would get on pews, lean a ladder up against it, and hurl the Christmas decorations over and hope that they wouldn't come through. So we put a steel bar in there, and we built that and turned it into dedicated tech space. Hi, Jero, down there, so it's the same sort of thing. And what that's done, like it's done here, is given you a gift to the community of a multifunctional, usable meeting, gathering space, and so on. Now, you know how long the bloody lockdown came on in this place, right? In Quebec. It just kept going and going and going and going. So we had this gorgeous labyrinth, and we couldn't get in the building to use it. So I threw out a grant application, can't even remember to where, and said, can I build one in the garden as well? There's your concert space when it's full. So we did. Same engineers, let's do a different design. We built this in the front yard. There it is finished. There it is in the winter. Right, they're not going to stop us doing that. And there it is just recently in the summer where the kids decided to have a campfire, and so they made the fire to go in the middle of it. We also started growing food in these boxes in the courtyard. If we couldn't get it out to a lot of people, could we support the Solidarity Gardens in Point Claire by doing this? And that's what we've done. And we are now working on this part of our garden, turning it into an Indigenous healing garden, Indigenous meaning planting indigenous species to encourage insects, birds, etc. So, two strands of the story then come together, the food and this changing places that God inflicted on us. On September the 17th, we had this crazy idea, well, we had it before then, to hold a long table event. I have no idea if you know what those are, but basically you set long tables and people show up. Where were we going to do it? Outside. So we printed these, we put them out in everybody's box in the neighborhood. I got to talk with a lot of the neighbors. Why are you doing this? Is it a fundraiser? No, aren't you fed up of just being locked up for 2 years? We're just going to go and sit and eat. And that's what we did. It was awesome. Absolutely awesome. This family here is a refugee family from Syria that we had helped back in the teens, and they showed up too. We had 130 places that we set on the lawn. That's the number of chairs we had that we could put out, and they were all filled, and people stayed to the end, and it was wonderful. So a couple of things, 3 things to draw from this. these stories coming together. There's more of them enjoying their time. This is my big takeaway. God is not above using apparent disasters to break us open and turn us inside out. Flood and pandemic helped us to get over ourselves and get real about being a church in our location. And paradoxically, in the process of doing this, trying to focus on local needs, we've become what we're calling now a glocal community, because we have people who are worshiping with us online, doing where they are what we're doing. And that is a pandemic story. We wouldn't even have imagined doing that before the pandemic. And something that we're picking up on everything we've done so far: find your neighbors, find your partners, don't wait for them to come to us. And support those doing things like feeding people, support them if they do it better than we. Just get your people involved in feeding people if that's what you've done. And get grantors to become partners too. People who hand out grants, whether it's federal, provincial, local, denominational, if you keep telling them your story, they want to come back to you. You're a good investment. So I probably am going to get shot by my denomination for saying that and sharing that with you, but do it. It does work. We are a repeat recipient of federal grants because we made good on the first one. So it's worth the effort if you can. And lastly, risk failure, try anything, go bold, and expect pushback later.
It's dangerous to go after a preaching professor. This will become a prop. In our case, it all began with a prayer, or to be more precise, a pandemic and a prayer. Like in most communities, when the pandemic first hit and our church buildings closed, there were a lot of unknowns, anxieties, and fears. This was true not only personally and pastorally, but also institutionally. St. Michael's, which is one of the churches that I work with in the Quebec City area, the church where I am the interim priest in charge, 3 years and running, where I am 1/3 time, is a precariously small community with 21 members, one that has been struggling to survive in the midst of unstable clerical leadership historically, and the collapse of church membership and resources. So just prior to the pandemic, St. Michael's was gearing up for a major project that involved redeveloping its hall in order to facilitate some new outreach ministries within the community. We had planned out a fair trade and sustainable artisans market. We were in the process of forming the groundwork for a cafe that would be financially accessible, a kind of meeting space for diverse and isolated people from the neighborhood. I'd even started roasting coffee to experiment with this. We were so sure at that time that we knew what God had in store for us, and we had already begun to act on it. We had our community partners, we had done our research. However, this project depended upon an unfortunate constellation of office rental income and grants. So you can imagine where this is going. The first lockdown forced us to close not only our doors to in-person worship, but also to close the doors on the projects that we were just in the process of initiating, projects that had been in the planning for a couple of years. Projects that had to be not only delayed, but actually canceled, as the pandemic changed the way people work, met and interacted. When we talk about 30-year timelines, when I think about St. Michael's as an example, that church ain't got 30 years. And that's the reality, I think, with some of our congregations. We're working on very tight timelines. So as a parish, we were left to sit in that uncomfortable space of unknowing, of not knowing what to do next, of having all our well-laid plans dashed upon the rocks. And so we did the one thing we could think of doing, the one thing left for us. We prayed. To be more specific, we began to meet online using Zoom. Probably a lot of you know that very well. And we use that online medium to do a form of prayer many Anglicans know as gospel-based discipleship. For those of you who are not familiar with it, gospel-based discipleship is a form of prayer and a methodology of discipleship formation put together by the Indigenous Anglican Church within Turtle Island. Inspired by a combination of the daily office, Lectio Divina, and Indigenous theology, it asks participants within the context of a short liturgy to read a passage of Scripture from the Gospel and to engage in a reflective dialogue over 3 questions. What in the Gospel reading today, an idea, word, or phrase jumps out for you? What is Jesus or the Gospel saying to you? What is Jesus or the Gospel calling you to do? We would, for a little plug for virtue ethics, we would also ask sometimes, what is the Gospel or Jesus calling us to be? Over the course of several months, we would meet 3 afternoons a week to pray in this way over lunch hour. Now, what surprised me as the priest in charge was that this form of prayer began to attract some folks who lived in our city and were kind of like on the margins or the kind of outliers of our community. We knew who they were and we sent them invitations, but they didn't normally attend a service and they were not deeply involved in our ministries. However, over the course of those months, something began to change in the group as we shared and reflected on the Scriptures. We told the biblical stories, and then we told our own stories. Bonds of solidarity began to form. Those folks who might not normally encounter one another in the neighborhood began to connect online. People who would not normally speak in a group began to share their ideas and their situations in life quite candidly, and in light of the Scripture, something that didn't often happen before. And the group began to expand beyond the immediate boundaries of our city, including folks from parishes in the Baie de Chaleur region and other regions of our diocese and beyond. As time went on, the participants in turn became leaders of the group. And eventually, as the pandemic restrictions lessened, and I returned to doing in-person visitations and liturgies, one of these leaders continued to lead the group, which actually continues to meet online in the evenings now every week. So we prayed. Now here's the interesting thing. Those discussions within the context of prayer and the gospel reading didn't end online. They ended up reverberating into the wider community. As we told our stories, it came out in our discussions that a common fear and struggle within our small parish and a concern in the wider community was this new relationship to technology we were all being forced into. We were all becoming increasingly dependent on it. And of course, this is very ironic because these discussions were happening on Zoom. Now, as we discussed, we shared our worries about the growing impact of e-waste and planned obsolescence, the impact that these are having on the land. We talked and prayed about the increasing power and wealth of tech moguls and the rising digital divide between the rich and the poor, the young and the old in our province and in our city. We reflected on the right to repair and the lack of access to knowledge and tools in our neighborhoods, especially in the youth we knew, who, while having grown up in a digital world, didn't actually necessarily understand how it all worked and weren't necessarily thinking through all of its ethical implications. All the while, our prayerful method of gospel-based discipleship kept bringing us back to the question, what is the gospel calling us to do or to be? Now, over the course of our gospel-based discipleship discussions, it came out that one of our participants was an IT professional who had recently retired. Always look for people who are recently retired. And it turned out that he was deeply connected to some of the other computer programmers and engineers in the city, people who worked at the Cégep teaching. You can probably guess where this is going. We no longer had access to our hall, but we did have access to the skills and gifts of our parish and other folks in our neighborhoods. What if we use those gifts to address a growing social, political, and economic concern? What if God was calling us to a ministry of digital discipleship? So we decided to build a laboratory, an actual physical laboratory, using the skills from this group, which we called Chapeau Vert. It was kind of like a digital maker space where we set up computer engineering projects, teaching kids coding, empowering them with the tools of repair, and equipping and commissioning them to help our elders with their devices. Building off our gospel-based discipleship network, we actually ended up setting up not just one laboratory, but two. So one in Quebec City and the other one in the Baie des Chaleurs region, in order to help bridge both the French and English divide and the rural-urban divide. Our Quebec City group is Francophone, and our Baie des Chaleurs group is Anglophone. And so using Zoom, we are able to connect and actually speak bilingually across some of these divides, sharing some of the computer engineering knowledge we have in the urban setting with knowledge and practitioners in the rural setting. I think it's kind of a beautiful irony that our cafe plans were sort of premised on creating a space for unlikely encounters, a space of dialogue that would help bridge some of the division in our communities. Without setting out to do so, Chapeau Vert is actually doing this in its own small but surprising way. In his work, The Anglican Ethicist, Samuel Wells argues that the Creator has already given us everything we need to be God's friends, to eat with, and to worship God. Before the pandemic, we thought God had given us everything we needed in our redevelopment of our spaces and our meticulously researched plans. It took the loss of those spaces and the failure of our well-laid plans to help us see that the gift God had already given us was actually just a few unlikely people and a set of prayerful questions. What we were being called to redevelop was not our building. It was our relationship with our near and distant neighbors in the land and beyond. I've described Chapeau Vert, but that's actually just the example of one ministry that's come out of these discussions. There have been several. But I think it's also important to say that this is one method, and it is not a panacea. It's not going to solve our church budgetary problems. It won't magically refill our empty pews. It's not going to repair our degrading buildings. And it's not particularly quick or charismatic. Like sourdough bread, it's a slow ferment. And I suspect, like wild yeasts, its results will always be unpredictable. They will differ based on the text you prayed with, the places where you pray them, and the people you pray them with. What's next for the church? I really have absolutely no idea. I have no idea what the church looks like beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. But I also don't feel like I need to know. As church leaders, I think our role is neither to strive against all odds to preserve our failing ecclesiastical institutions, nor do I think it's to hasten their demise. Rather, I think our role more fundamentally is to be critically creative and faithfully present and attentive to the people, the place, and the time in which God has given all of us to be. To discern, to name, and to honor the gifts that make up the land and our communities within the land. To borrow a phrase from the theologian Willie James Jennings, I find my hope for the church's future in this: that a new space of communion is always ready to appear, where the people of God reach down to join the land and reach out to join those around them, their near and distant neighbors. Prayer, I suggest, in the form of the Indigenous community's practice of gospel-based discipleship, is just one way to begin that journey.
Good afternoon. First, start off with the context of St. Philip's. For those who don't know it, St. Philip's is located on the boundary between Montreal West and Notre-Dame-de-Grâce. Have our feet in two worlds. And although Montreal West is a very affluent neighborhood, we are literally on Sherbrooke Street, and right across Sherbrooke Street are the CP rail tracks. And the other side of the tracks is really the other side of the tracks. The West Haven neighborhood is one of the pockets of poverty and a food desert in NDG. As a parish, we're successful at achieving diversity. We have people from both worlds. From doctors and lawyers and university professors to janitors and maids, white Anglos, West Indians, Chinese, and a number, I think we count about 20 or 25 nations that people come from. Our greatest asset as a parish is our land. Those of you who just received your tax bills from the City of Montreal, the Montreal NDG portion of our land is presently, in the new assessment, was assessed at $3.3 million. That's the land only, not the building, and that's only about 55% of our land. Our church campus, the open part of the campus, is the largest piece of privately owned open space in Montreal West and NDG, Western NDG. And when I came to St. Philip's 13 years ago, the parish was in quite a bit of financial difficulty, and we started discussions on how do we get out of that. And the land was the center of that. And we started thinking about redeveloping it, turning a profit. Well, when you're dealing with land in two different straddles, two different municipalities, a lot of developers were, even though they were salivating over the land, they were also very realistic about the possibility, the unlikelihood of getting two city councils to agree on a development plan. So those discussions languished and really went nowhere. Meanwhile, in 2019, one of our parishioners started a small garden on a corner of the property. And that got us thinking. And actually had a conversation with a Jewish neighbor on could the land be turned to productive agricultural use. And suddenly, we found the way to make our land, if not economically productive, missionally productive. And through some networking in the neighborhood, we had have a long-standing relationship with the Depot Community Food Center. We also made connections with Incredible Edibles, the NDG branch of a movement that started in England of creating free community gardens. And they have about 13 gardens across NDG on sidewalks, in front of the firehouse, in front of the Metro grocery store, that are tended by volunteers, and anyone can come and pick what's there. So we started talking with them about creating an Incredible Edibles garden at St. Philip's. And then we made a connection with a professor at Concordia who teaches a class in food and sustainability. And he suggested to a group of his students, talk to St. Philip's. They may have an interesting project for you. And we came together around the idea, well, what if we turn a big portion of our lawn, which is just grass that's doing nothing, into a community garden that provides food for the neighborhood, especially those on the wrong side of the tracks who don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. And then someone put us in touch with a neighbor on Connaught Avenue who was just graduating with a certificate in permaculture design. And we had a conversation with her. And what if we took not just garden beds, but transformed the whole property into a permaculture landscape and a food forest, not just growing vegetables, but what if we had apple trees and plum trees and berry patches? So in 2019, this started to come together. The group of Concordia students created some raised beds and were able to plant some seeds in time for a late summer harvest of lettuces and radishes. And in the fall and winter, we started looking at the grand scheme of it. The Anglican Foundation announced a call for proposals, parish projects to address climate change in your local area. Bingo. And we submitted our food forest idea to that and received a grant from the Anglican Foundation. And had Lumi designed us a plan, a comprehensive plan for the property for plantings. And wow, we have this idea, we have money to fund it. We added a grant from the Loyola District Councilor from his discretionary funds. And the winter of 2020, we started putting plans in place to redevelop the property as this food forest and permaculture gardens. And then the pandemic hit. Well, the good thing about that was this was all taking place outside. We could still get together to plant trees. Just keep distancing. And We got an initial order of 5 trees, and we had 5 different family groups, each digging one hole and planting 1 tree. A volunteer from the neighborhood came by and constructed more raised beds. And then once the beds were planted, were constructed, we put together a team of gardeners, and they'd come by singly or in pairs, working distance, to prepare the beds, to plant, to weed, to water. And it turned into the perfect pandemic project. And throughout the summer, volunteers would come to tend the garden, and we advertised it in the local media, the Montreal West community newspaper, through social media. Come, help yourselves to the produce. And people came. And the volunteers reported, as they were working in the garden, people would stop by to see what was growing, to pick a few things, and more importantly, to talk. In that time of social interaction, when face-to-face conversations were rare, people were so happy to have someone to talk to, where they could remain distanced and safe. And I started doing turns out in the garden, sometimes working, sometimes I just took a chair out there and sat and talked to people coming by. People walking their dogs, people walking on their way to the shops on Westminster, or to the bus station or the train station. People in the neighborhood coming to play with their kids on the lawn. And these opportunities for conversations. This is all free. We can take whatever we want. And why are you doing this? And then it gets into the opportunity to talk about our commitment, our baptismal covenant to care for the environment. To talk about the problems that some people have with food and food availability. And how this is a way for someone who might be too proud to go to the depot to get a food basket, to get some fresh produce for their table. And we meet all types. Actually, our most popular crop, anyone want to guess? Dill. Dill, yes. Do you ever buy dill at the supermarket? You get too much of it, yeah. You only need a little bit, but you have to spend $4 to get a whole bunch. To be able to come by and just snip one plant. This past spring, we created an herb spiral. An herb spiral is a mound built around a spiral foundation of bricks. And what it does, it creates little microclimates. And so you can have plants like rosemary and lavender at the top, where it's dry and very sunny, and herbs that require more water and less sunlight on the shadier side. So each herb has its little microclimate. And that, again, has been very popular. Parsley, basil, oregano, rosemary, and lovage. The lovage has been extremely popular. Again, something you only need one little snip of to flavor a soup. You're not going to go buy a whole lot, but people are coming by. And our gardeners and myself, those of us who are out there working, are encountering these people, making connections. And so now we have a team of about 13 people volunteering in the garden. Half of them are members of the parish. Half of them are members of the community. And we've formed this network that's extending beyond our parish membership list, making new connections, making friends, and bringing them into mission. We see this as a 10-year or more project, not all at once. Eventually, our design includes an open area of lawn, possibly with an arbor or canopy structure to be used for outdoor weddings. One of our parish activities is at the transition from spring to summer. We have an outdoor Eucharist and picnic. For a member of the parish who is part of a local jazz group did a free outdoor concert there last summer. Just an outdoor jam session where they invited people and passed the hat for donations for the depot. We're adding more trees. We planted this fall an edible hedge, a hedge of currants along one side of one stretch of Sherbrooke Street, and we're starting another hedge of sea buckthorn along Brock Avenue. And just given the people that's come by, it's becomes more a place of gathering and interaction, and making it an inviting place, and really raising our profile in the community. So we're enthusiastic about seeing where this is going to lead missionally.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, Jeff, and Jim for those stories. I want to ask you a couple of questions, and maybe you can pass this back amongst each other. Let me ask you this question first. Actually, before I ask you this, well, let me ask you the question. Tell us about a mistake you made in relation to ministry, and perhaps the story you told us. And maybe just stand up when you talk.
I'm going to take 1 minute to think about the best or worst mistake that I've made.
There's so many to pick from, right?
Yeah. Do you want to? You can also take a minute.
I think the mistake was when we came up with the plan initially, thinking that was going to be it and it's going to go according to that, and not initially not being flexible to see where it would evolve.
I think we spent a good part of the spring, summer of the first year of the pandemic thinking that we had sunk $100,000 into a kitchen we would never get to use. It felt awful, and I think it made us a little gun-shy to keep moving forward. You know, you sort of, did we do the wrong thing? I mean, it's like your question, right? You know, you build something that depends on people being there and you have to shut the door. So, you know, it's hard to answer that question. There are so many every day, but that was the collective one, and I think the challenge of leadership with that is to create enough space to say, maybe we really got it wrong, but God is still trying to tell us something. So, hope that answers, but it felt like a massive one.
I think one of our mistakes, maybe consistently, has been trying to get all our ducks in a row before we do anything. And so there's this line that the theologian Mary Jo Letty uses: sometimes you have to begin before you're ready. And I think that's a lesson we learned to much frustration during the pandemic.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, hold on. I'll come to you. Jared, do we have that third microphone? Go ahead.
You spoke about the leadership challenge, and that's what I was going to ask about before. And the a tremendous difficulty is I think, in any organization, a church organization, is unity of effort. You're going to have diverse ideas on what to do, and when like in our church, for instance, there's for decades, literally decades, there has been a recognition of a need for change because the way we're going is not working, and there's never any agreement on whenever an idea is proposed, there's never an agreement is the way forward, and there's always a lot of disagreements because it's going to upset somebody's apple cart. How did leadership evolve? How did you obtain unity of effort to rally behind your 3 projects? And before you answer, I have a connection to each one of you, as it turns out. I was not born, but I was raised in Montreal West, so I have a lot of experience with St. Philip's Church. There was a lot of activities when I was a kid in the 60s. There were sports activities, movie nights and stuff that drew community children, me, in there. I wasn't a member of the church, so that happened. I live around the corner from Cedar Park United, and for 1 year in 1979-80, I was a resident of Sainte-Foy in Quebec City. So I have a connection to all 3 of you.
I can answer that, and I think I can only speak about the St. Michael's context, I think, to answer your question well, and that's, I think our leadership was facilitated by the disaster of leadership, quite frankly. St. Michael's had about 10 priests over something like 12 or 13 years, and so that was obviously very harmful for that community. The flip side of that, the redemptive note of that, is the community developed practices of resilience and consensus leadership. And because of that, came to a way of meeting that I think is kind of maybe unique to that parish, in that they discuss things, they listen, and if someone doesn't agree necessarily with a direction, they will voice that, they'll articulate it, but they're also willing to sit back and say, this is not where I would take things, but I will still be supportive of the community and this person. That, again, only arrived from like a history of struggle in that context. I'm not sure how generalizable that would be, but I think consensus leadership is a practice we would all do well to cultivate intentionally.
Thinking on my feet, literally. One of the things when I came to Cedar Park, we have the opposite, I guess. I think I'm only number 9 in 100 and something. So, people tend to hang around for a bit of a while. So there's a certain amount of investment in the person we've hired is going to be our leader. And that also has its own problems, right? But certainly throughout this major fluctuation that we have all been living with, it's the KISS principle, I think, has kind of worked. We know God wants us to feed people, so how are we going to do it? Any idea is a good idea if it's shared. Any idea that isn't shared doesn't have a hope. So you kind of foster it by saying, I don't know all the answers on how we're supposed to answer Mark 6:37, but we're supposed to, so let's get on with it. And the second thing I would say with that is, I think when the energy, and we saw it, I think, a little bit in the leadership in Quebec, and not just Quebec, everywhere, the whole thing with the pandemic, where people want somebody to come out with the right answer and we're all going to follow it. And to get caught up in that freneticism. And yet, I guess I kept coming back personally to my prayer life and saying, there's only room in my head for one thing right now, God. What is it? And it kept coming back to being a consistent message. So I guess what I would say, a challenge for leadership, when there's friction, or when there's the opposite of friction and it's kind of apathy, is to keep consistently going back to who your core identity and values are. That's what we did when we came up with that logo thing. We're not changing anything, we're just doing it in a different way. So there's a consistency to the gospel that sometimes I think we get in the way of and complicate.
I think one of the good things about the garden project was we were not investing a whole lot of money in it. So even though there were naysayers, okay, that's not a whole lot of money on the line. It's other people's money that we were spending. But I think also the key aspect of leadership was having a couple lay people who were became very passionate about the idea and took the ball. Began running with the ball and making those connections and advocating for it. And sometimes you get the right person with the power in the parish to change some minds. Can do more than the priest can.
Thank you. Hold on to that. Let me ask you this question, all of you. This morning, when Tim was talking, he named the powers of this world. Individualism, autonomy, racism, consumerism, inequality, climate change, and talked about the temptation towards idolatry, and also talked about Christ's triumph over the powers. So it's kind of a big question. We've asked you to ground and contextualize us in specific contexts, but when you think about those powers, the powers of this age, the powers of this world, and Tim also talked about the temptation to want to give in and to give up. And what we've heard from you are stories of keeping going. I guess the question for you is, just take one of those powers: individualism, autonomy, racism, consumerism, inequality, climate change. Where have you encountered one of those powers in the ministry that you're engaged in? And how have you avoided the temptation of giving in or giving up? Just a light question for a Saturday afternoon.
So I'm going to go first, then I can just pretend like I had the answer all along, but really it's just off the top of my head. The autonomy one, I think, is big, and it's a different way of naming it than maybe some people would use. Is it rampant individualism? But the autonomous piece, I'm a type A overachieving personality, just in case you hadn't picked that up already. So, I mean, this one, I'm constantly having to confess that one. But I do think it's endemic, particularly in a community, and I'm talking a little bit of an Anglo community in a dominant Quebec. You've got lots of patterns of personal resilience, bordering on autonomy, and so sometimes it's really hard to figure out when that's idolatrous or a negative power and how it gets used for good as well. And so that's navigating. It's the same with the secularism or any of the other ones. It's navigating, and it's not always the same. But it's always helpful, and I think it was Grace earlier, okay, thanks for the synopsis, we kind of knew it, now let's get on with it. It's true, we need to keep reminding ourselves that these are at work. And somebody else mentioned, Quebec is really good at over-managing every part of our life, and so you've got this knee-jerk reaction in our congregations and in ourselves. That would be my biggie.
I think for us, maybe I'll reframe it and say, I think the temptation is consumerism. And I think, the point of this digital discipleship, this Chapeau Vert project, was is to push back on that a little bit by, repairing things that we would throw out. So it seems like a good. There's a danger in that too, though, right? And the danger is that we fall into the pattern of thinking, that this is what's going to attract the young peoples, right? I think that's something that, I've had at least one parishioner within the Quebec City community ask, this is great, so what is the hook? Like, how are you getting them to come to church then on Sunday? And likewise, I've had, on the secular note, a young person say, this is an amazing program. I have no idea why a church is doing it. Because the majority of people, of the kids who are part of it, they have no connection to our church. They just heard about it in the community. So I think the consumerism, the falling into the mistake that this program or this project is a way of creating that space of desire to lead people into being economic sustainers of our institutions that already exist. To me, that's the biggest temptation.
I think it comes down to the question that people ask, why? Why are we doing this with our land? Why are we doing it when we could have sold it for $1 million or more? Why are we doing it just for people to take, not selling the produce? And I think it's being very countercultural with our land, and getting the people both within the church and outside the church who don't really understand that, and pushing back against that.
Last question from me before I turn it over, and we'll invite a few more questions here. This morning we heard from Tim this idea of church as pushing us towards a deeper shared life, and the importance of porosity, of flow, and not buffering ourselves and keeping us out. And Elizabeth, you were just picking up on the autonomy piece. I guess just briefly, what's the vision of what the church is that's motivating you here, right? Like we heard from Tim, this vision of deeper shared life and how that led to, Cohere and these, refugee sponsorship programs, and all over the course of many decades, of course, but all motivated by a vision of really like, what is it that's driving us forward here? What is that in a phrase, if you can? And it's tough to boil down to a phrase. What is that vision that's driving you forward? Use that one.
I think for St. Philip's, the idea is reintegrating ourselves into the community. That St. Philip's was founded as a neighborhood church. Over the years, people have moved away and continue to come back, or people came because of a previous rector or assistant priest. And so now we draw from Chateauguay and Greenfield Park and downtown, Westmount, Côte-des-Neiges, Ville Saint-Laurent, Pierrefonds, Vaudreuil, Pointe-Claire, Lachine, LaSalle, and everywhere in between. So, and I think in part we lost some of that connection to the local community. And I think this is a way of re-engaging with our neighbors and reintegrating into the Montreal West NDG community.
I think your question was, what's the vision of the church that keeps us going? Okay, I don't have one. Somewhere along the line, I stopped trying to imagine what God wanted to do with the church and started to focus on what God wants to do in the world. And honestly, that's where I go. That's it. Do I get a t-shirt? Yeah, I was going to say, I get an A in his class for that.
Amen. I think we don't have the answer, and I think our diocese and I think our parish might, this probably isn't very popular in church world, but we actually eschew mission statements because we think that it's probably more important in this age we live in to think more about virtues. And so I think God has given us everything we need. It is already there in the people we already have. We have enough people. We have the right people. We have all of the resources we need. As Mary Jo Letty once said, if you need money, you can always rob a bank.
Good, short answers. And I'll just draw your attention, Elizabeth said the focus is on what God is doing in the world, and it's right there on the screen. Not above using apparent disasters to break us open and turn us inside out. And also to highlight, Jeffrey just quoted himself from earlier, but this will be my gloss on it, which is just fine. But God has already given us everything we need to be friends with God, to eat with one another, and what was the third thing? And to worship God. That's right, which is a church statement. So enough highfalutin nonsense from me. I'm going to turn us over to one final activity in just a moment, but are there questions? Yes, I see one right here. Gerald will bring you the microphone.
I just wanted to say that from what I heard from all three of you, with the wonderful projects that you have going, what you are saying is don't try to bring people into the church to worship. Reach out to them where they are. And that is something that I know from a personal aspect in our church. There's always been that tendency of how can we bring people in? How can we get people to come? How can we increase our numbers? And what I have heard from the three of you is that is not the way to go. And I thank you for that.
You're here. Yes.
I'd like to also to add to that, and that is, I stand on City Council, the City of Point Claire, and so I have a personal sense of mission that is related both to what I do in City Council and what I do with the church, and that is trying to be useful. I think that's what the message is try to find ways to be useful to the community, and then the community will respond. I think churches and all church organizations, all religious organizations in the past didn't have to ponder being useful. The message of salvation and the resurrection was universally accepted, and everybody desperately wanted it. But now the people that are not members of the church, that message isn't particularly doesn't resonate with them. So you have to come up with other ways of demonstrating your utility to the community and to society, and then they will respond when they recognize it.
I just wanted to thank each of you, but particularly to pick up on one piece. We were talking about the ability to reach across cultures and across geography using technology. That was really quite amazing. And we're all struggling with, now that we're supposed to be getting back to normal, what do we do with all of these amazing communities that have been created in online space? I just wanted to let you know that next Saturday, the community of St. Benedict's Table, which is a parish, quite a missional and outrageously crazy parish in downtown Winnipeg, is sponsoring a conference called Babel 2.0. Can Faith Survive Online? You can register for free and attend online. It's $25 if you want to go in person, but I don't think anybody's going to drive to Winnipeg next weekend. You can go online. It's at stbenedictstable.ca. And the keynotes are Catherine Schmidt, who is a theologian and scholar that's done a lot of work on religion, theology, and technology from the States. Michael Corin, who many of you will know, Anglican priest from the Diocese of Montreal, former Roman Catholic, former Niagara, rather, sorry. And Nora Young, who was the host of Spark on CBC Radio, as well as David Balzer, who is a professor at Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg, who's done a lot of work on this kind of stuff as well. I really commend that to you. It looks like it's going to be a dynamite opportunity. So stbenedictstable.ca.
I thought I saw somebody else's hand at some point. So we're coming close to the end of our time together. I wonder if I could invite you back into the same groups that we were in this morning as best you can. Those of you who are here with other folks from your congregation, feel free to join with them. And the question I want you to ask is, and think about in your groups is this one. We have up on the board, on the walls rather, we have these trajectories identified this morning by Tim, from charity and advocacy to seeking justice for the least, from homogeneity and diversity to intercultural life in Christ, from isolation to community to radical hospitality. We've also heard these stories from Jim and Jeff and Elizabeth this afternoon. And so the question I want you to ask yourself now is, at church tomorrow, I hope you're there, what is one thing you want to tell somebody else from today? What is one thing you want to tell somebody else today, and why that thing? And from all of this material here, what is the thing that excites you, that gives you energy, that you want to share with somebody else? So if we can just go into groups again for just a few minutes, and then we'll come back together in about 7 or 8 minutes to conclude. I said this morning that no one Saturday is going to come up with all the answers for anything, and today has not been a beginning and it has not been an end. It has just been one more step along a journey that we walk together. And so I want to say thank you to all of you for sharing this step in the journey, and I hope you have heard a new story today, met a new person, and can tell somebody a new thing. As I said, next week we'll send around the material from today and collect many of the other things that people have been feeding into me and share it with you all. But I do just want to offer a sincere word of thanks and encouragement. The word encouragement means to put the heart within. And the Bible speaks about God doing that to us. And so I hope that our hearts are encouraged as we walk the path God has laid before us. I've asked my colleague Neil Mancour from the Diocese of Montreal to come forward and offer us a word of concluding prayer.
Gracious God, we thank you for everything we've heard, for everything we've thought, for everything we've talked about, for the stories, for the new ideas, the new connections. So we ask that you would continue to ferment those in our hearts and grant us the vision to see how you already are at work in the communities around all our churches and where we live, that we might know how it is you call us to love our neighbor. In Jesus' name, amen.